Good afternoon and welcome to this policy forum by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where we are talking about bridging the Iraq-US business gap. Before I get to the theme, if you like to ask questions, please either use the Zoom function for those who are joining us via Zoom. For those who are tuning in via YouTube, please email your questions to me directly at policyforum, that's one word, policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Despite improvements in Iraq's security environment and Iraq's 2023 hefty budget of $153 billion, American businesses are still quite reluctant to enter the market. The challenges that are usually cited include unclear rules, widespread corruption, increasingly the risk of Iran sanctions, and perhaps other challenges that include red tape and operating in that bureaucratic environment. I think this is a loss for both countries. US firms are missing out on opportunities to explore this largely untapped Iraqi market of 50 million. And Iraqis are also missing out the benefits of linking up to US technology and growth. On the Iraqi side, without the private sector growing, Iraq would remain chronically dependent on oil, whose prices it does not control, for the government's income, and the government remains the largest, if not the sole employer. And as Iraqi youth and college graduates enter the market, the government alone is just simply unable to absorb them into the government sector, the public sector. And as we saw with the protest of Tishreen in 2019, the public, they need jobs, and that's a major challenge. And without a thriving private sector, Iraq is unable to put that Iraqi youth, half of the Iraqi population are under the age of 30, to put them into productive sectors. So today, I'm very pleased to discuss how we can bridge this gap between US and Iraqi businesses. And I'm very fortunate to have excellent speakers to address this very topic. To my immediate left is Mais Abbas Abousy. She is a senior attorney with the Commercial Law Development Program at the US Department of Commerce at the Office of the General Counsel. Mais has primarily advised governments in the Middle East and North Africa on legal reforms and economic development issues for over a decade. She has led technical assistance to improve Iraq's business legal environment, which is one of our key topics today. And she's a native speaker of Arabic language, grew up partly in Baghdad, and she wants to be known as an amateur triathlete, but I refuse to put the word amateur and triathlete in the same sentence. To her left is Safwan Al-Amin. Safwan is an international attorney and a public policy advisor who counsels corporations as well as regional governments on legislative and regulatory matters. Since obtaining advanced degrees from Yale and Harvard and the University of London, he has published regularly on legal and constitutional matters related to Iraq, and I'm very pleased to have published a couple of co-authored pieces with Safwan on the issues of the Constitution and Iraq's legal framework. Joining us hopefully soon from Baghdad will be Dr. Amer Aladhadh. He's an Iraqi-American economist who serves as an advisor to Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani, and he's also the chief executive of the government's Reform Management Cell. Previously, Dr. Amer advised the Qatari government, and he also participated in UN economic commissions for Europe public-private partnerships, and has worked partly in doing analyses, quite statistical analyses for hedge funds on Wall Street. In his capacity as an advisor and head of the Reform Cell, we'll be tapping on his expertise and his purview on the priorities of this government to address some of the challenges that will come up. Again, if you have questions, you send them to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org, or you use the Zoom function. Without further ado, let's get right to it. Mais, I'm going to start with you. You've been looking into this space for over a decade, as I just said in your bio. So give us your take. the lay of the land, the business land, where things were, where things are, probably where things are headed. Where do you think Iraq stands? How do you, or how, if you can channel U.S. businesses, how do U.S. businesses see that Iraqi market and government landscape?
I think they don't see it. So let's start, I think, with there.
Okay.
I think they don't see it. So the way I would look at Iraq, I've always been cautiously optimistic. And I think those are the two words that everyone has used within the Beltway and beyond the Beltway. But I think the issue is that when U.S. companies looked at Iraq, they looked at it always from a post-conflict country for decades. And only now are we seeing some form of stability. And every time we get a sense of a little bit of stability, it goes right back. And so Iraq then has now developed a very bad reputation for unable to maintain that stability. And so the type of business that ends up only really getting to that space is government contracts, major, concessions, government concessions, more security-based contracts, and obviously more oil and gas-centric sectors that's really what it has been for a really long time. But we're now entering, and I think we've seen stability for a little bit more than what people have seen, because U.S. companies don't see Iraq and have basically turned an eye on it. Other partners, regional partners, have entered into the space, and others that do see Iraq have now invested. And that, unfortunately, limits access to the various markets that U.S. companies could have tapped into.
So you seem to be making a distinction. I think this is going to be important for the Iraqi audience in particular. You're making a distinction between the U.S. government and U.S. businesses. Does each side see it?
Well, I think I will put myself in the position if I was a U.S. business, and if I was whether a major corporation or a small corporation, if I don't see, whether I'm in the United States or in any other country, and if I'm a general counsel or in-house counsel for any of these companies, the first thing I'm going to see is what type of U.S. support, what type of diplomatic relationship does the respective country have with Iraq. And in the case of the U.S., it's primarily security. And because it's primarily security, primarily focused on oil and gas, then the U.S. company is going to be like, okay, this is the type of support in which I can get. And so that's where it really has been. But once you shift that dialogue, once there are indicators that the relationship has truly changed, whether it be by the type of commercial contracts the U.S. government supports. And what I mean by supports, it's not the same support, for instance, how China supports its industry, or how the German government supports industry, or how the French or the Italians do so, but by perception and by show, that is what then changes the dial.
I see. I'll get back to unpack some of the points you raised, but let me ask Safwan a question. Basically just jumping off of the answer that Mais just gave. U.S. investors and funds, when I asked them, and I've run a couple of policy watches about this, policy forums in the past about this. When you say like Iraq, 50 untapped markets and capital, and I just said $153 billion, and you look at the real estate, American businesses, they cite weak rule of law as a major obstacle to why they don't find the Iraqi business landscape attractive. What does that mean? What does it mean when you say, oh, rule of law is weak and therefore that's a deterrent to us?
Yeah, so I think we should limit this, like the definition of rule of law here, as far as, in the context of what we're discussing, which is businesses. What do businesses look for? Putting aside security issues that are obviously very related to rule of law, I think a business wants, enforcement of contracts, that the government is able to enforce contracts. It wants to make sure that there are no sudden changes in the law that kind of retroactively impact their investments. It wants to make sure that they're not, their investments will not be expropriated. No arbitrary application of laws and rules, and also clearer regulation where you know the steps that you need to take to enter the market, to do business, And that seems to be missing in Iraq. Though the only positive side that I have seen has been that courts in cases tend to rule against the government, or if the government has kind of canceled a contract without cause, courts have been comfortable ruling against the government, which maybe in other countries in the region you don't find. But all these rule of law encompasses so many different things, and many of the elements of rule of law are perceived to be lacking in Iraq. And I think Mace touched on a very important point, is that the perception that exists in the US is that there's no rule of law, there are issues. The relationship between the US and Iraq is primarily a security relationship. And I think that perception takes a lot to change. Now, in the context of that, the actual legal framework hasn't moved in a positive direction as far as FDI is concerned, as far as foreign direct investment. The changes in laws that have happened over the last, say, 10 years, to my mind, have been negative, actually discouraging foreign direct investment. So there's a lot beyond the signaling that the government needs to do. There needs to be actual changes in the law.
Like what? Because the books seem to be changing. Like every now and then we hear of a commercial law, and then there's a law that kind of negates that.
Yeah.
And then we had laws on the book that were put through the times of the investment law and the time of the CPA.
Yeah.
But then we had the subsequent of laws and government regulations in a way that, to me, it's confusing, but I wonder how does the business community see it?
I mean, confusing is good for lawyers. So we're supposed to help sort through that. But the issues that you have, the basic law, the civil code, is from the 50s, 1951. You have a commerce code that's from 1984. So all different times, in terms of the political economy, the philosophy of the system. And then post 2003, you had I think was it 39 or 38, Order 39 or 38, that liberalized the economy for foreign investors. And then the investment law in 2006, which has been amended a couple of times, that actually repealed the CPA order, liberalizing the economy. So some of the rules reverted back to the pre-2003 era. The two developments that I find quite negative recently have been the change in the companies law that basically does not allow foreign ownership of more than 49% in Iraqi LLCs and joint stock companies. The other development has been in the commercial agency law, which is basically almost, if you read it, the application has been, I would say, arbitrary and hasn't been very clear, but it almost mandates the appointment of an Iraqi agent if you want to import, products into the country. There's a good distinction to be made now, actually, in relation to commercial agency between doing business, investing in Iraq and doing business in Iraq, and then trading with Iraq. So selling products or even franchise, I think franchise agreements could fall under it's in the middle, but it falls maybe into kind of trading with Iraq.
Get back to what worked, because we do want to highlight not just what doesn't work, but what actually works. So I'll get back to that for sure. Let me go to Baghdad. Dr. Amer, thanks for joining us. So you advised the Prime Minister on key reform issues, and you had the government's reform unit. So from your current purview, what are the priorities of this Iraqi government, of this Prime Minister, and how serious is this government about attracting foreign direct investment in general and US ones in particular?
Thank you for having me. I'm glad I could clear up some of these things. One of the things that we're working on, I think Safwan is going to be happy about, is we are rolling back some of the back steps he has mentioned. We're trying to reinstate the majority ownership of foreign businesses. There is a proposal for that right now as a law. Also, we are gathering up a lot of the impediments in a proper situational assessment to formulate a proper policy, permanent policy of the Iraqi government As you know, there is a new policy directorate at the Prime Minister's office that will be that we're injecting new blood into it. About 100 new employees are going to work diligently on taking seriously the comments that a lot of the businesses are putting forward to liberalize the economy. And His Excellency was very clear to me that he is serious about attracting foreign direct investment and making the business environment more business friendly.
So reform is like every government comes and talks about reform and makes reform a priority, but I want to understand like what reform actually means in the Iraqi context, like, you know, in the hallways of government, when officials or ministers or even the prime minister, when they talk about reform, what is it they actually mean? Because we've seen previous iterations, you know, the white paper, we've seen the World Bank have a push, we've seen the IMF have like different commitments that they got from Iraq. So for every time that I heard an Iraqi official say that Iraq is open for business and I got a penny for that, I would be somewhere else financially. Like, what can we realistically expect? Because this is 2023, so 20 years after the war. Realistically, what kind of reform do you think is possible? Let me put it this way. What kind of reform do you see political support for?
So let me just start by saying that we started by taking into account all the previous work, the national development strategies and the white paper, and of course, various other stakeholders' input, formulating in a policy for economic reform. Now, when we say reform, we mean moving to a market economy, to liberalizing the economy, to attracting investment. That's basically the general principle of action. What we can expect political support for. I think that in any system, there are vested interests in the status quo, and there are interests in moving forward. And there is an equilibrium between the two. I think that we are moving towards liberalizing the economy further. I think that there is favorable headwind for that. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that there are people against it, but you know, these things, they play out in Parliament. It's not for me to say what's going to happen, but I will tell you that whatever the reforms that we are proposing from the government side will be for a more prosperous Iraq with significant investment, both foreign and domestic.
Mais, let me circle back to you. So we covered quite kind of a laundry list of challenges,
yeah,
right? But one word came up once and another word that hasn't come up yet. Corruption, which I think, like reform, every prime minister promises to make it a priority. What does that mean when American businesses look at the Iraqi market and the Iraqi business landscape? You know, every now and then you have this kind of scathing reports out of Iraq, you know, not only the rankings on Transparency International, but also like Netflix materials like Heist of the Century on one hand. But then on the other, American businesses are also very squeamish about staying clear of sanctions on Iran.
mm-hmm.
Are these two considerations with FCPI on one hand and Iranian sanctions? I mean, there are some improvements, I think, that we've heard from Dr. Amer and, you know, some good news that Safwan shared, but we have kind of this old lingering problem of corruption and then this kind of newish radioactive material of Iranian sanctions. How does these two factors factor in?
So before I answer that, I want to add, because I'm always cautiously optimistic,
Okay.
I want to add to the optimism. First of all, I like to really applaud how you made it into a 3 pockets, which is trading with Iraq, doing business in Iraq, and investing in Iraq. And I think that's really important to make that distinction when it comes in policy and in law. And I think the government of Iraq has done tremendous, from where we're sitting, efforts in making sure on the arbitration side of signing the New York Convention, which took about a decade plus. They signed the Tier Convention, which is addressing customs and border. They're signed on to potentially, bring on the Asakuda software, which is dealing again with trade, and so on and so forth. So there's those are all building up and showcasing, or pretty much the current government in Iraq telling the world that we are really trying our best and trying to change the image in that aspect. Is that we've signed all these. Now this is when we roll up our sleeves. So now to your question, which is a very loaded question. So I'm going to try to answer it as possible as I can. As I was coming over here, I wanted to look at statistics, and I know some of you here are very into statistics, but if I can ask everyone at your spare time, just Google Iraq and investment, just Google those two words and click on the news feature and see what is coming. It's a drastic different entries that are popping up now versus what they popped up 2 years ago, just within that.
Do tell.
So you have a lot of regional investment articles coming out between Qatar and the region going in, also with Europe and also with a major Total deal. That probably would have never really seen even within the queries because it would have been just bogged down with security and political issues. Now on corruption, let's just take that head on. Look at transparency and corruption. Iraq is now, I think, 150 or something?
Yeah, like 20 points from the bottom.
And then you're looking at Sudan, which is in 178 or something like that. But all right, let's look who's around and who's US doing business with. So Egypt is at 130.
Yes.
That's not that far off. And you have a lot of US companies working in Egypt. And the Egyptian bureaucracy and their level of regulation and their level of corruption to some extent could also be known as a Netflix heist situation. So it does exist. It is bad. But I think the palette for US companies is so much. And maybe it's only 130 at the 130 range. So, or is it, but there's not that much of a, they're not far off within being at the next potential level.
Since you put a number on it, do you expect Iraq to get to 130 or do you expect the Americans to kind of tweak their threshold tolerance?
Well, statistics, I don't really, they're only as good as how you're looking at them and who makes them, right? I mean, the Doing Business report, look where we are now with that. But if we're going to take it at face value, I think it's two things. I think US companies are going to see that other countries are coming in and their opportunities are gone. So either they take into it or they do what they've been doing for the past few years, which is they're only really looking at the Asia market because that's where everyone's really pulling in all their FDI going out to. And by the way, the Department of Commerce does have all these statistics on our site. So if you're interested in looking at how US money goes in and out, that's what we do at the government. So
a beautiful plug.
So you can look at those statistics. But so one is the US palette has to change. Second, I think given what Dr. Amer has stated and given all the signing of agreements, the Iraqi government, and given what they're going to do about this major case and how it's going to play out in other cases regarding corruption, the CBI and others, how that plays out is going to signal.
People are watching.
Yes.
Makes sense. Let me actually ask what Mais just mentioned. The New York Convention on Arbitration talks about, again, Iraq joining WTO. What's the impact of this? How important are these steps in boosting investor confidence in the Iraqi market? What do they actually mean?
Before I answer that, I just want to go back to what May said. I mean, I 100% agree that it's a perception game here, right? And even the Transparency International index, it's a perception index, right? Now, that is not to say that it's not accurate, because there is a methodology that goes into it.
There's
But
effects, but yeah.
Exactly. So it's a perception, and there is a perception problem in Iraq. I mean, that's one of the things that even if you changed all the legal framework, if you change the legal framework, you took certain acts, if you don't actually change the perception, then you're still going to struggle to attract foreign direct investment. On the point related to that in terms of corruption is that the FCPA and the UK Bribery Act create costs for US businesses who operate in Iraq. That those costs do not exist for other companies in other countries. The costs are high, and they could even, I mean, if there is even a small issue that if there is a small FCPA issue for a US company, the DOJ takes this very seriously, and rightly so, and the companies themselves take it seriously because of the consequences of a FCPA violation. Internal investigations are expensive, and if it goes to a point where they need to notify the DOJ, then it gets very, very expensive. So all this raises the cost of doing business in Iraq, and companies take that into account. So it's not just the worry that, oh, maybe someone will ask for a bribe, or maybe there'll be a corruption issue, or there are internal mechanisms in the US that are different to other countries. And the US government is not going to turn a blind eye and say, well, we're going to let our companies off the hook because it's Iraq and other companies and other countries. No, and they shouldn't. And I mean, it would be ideal if all countries enforce similar standards for their companies operating outside of their country. On the New York Convention, as happy as I was, and you mentioned it took 10 years for that to be ratified, my understanding is that they were forced to ratify it because otherwise they wouldn't have had access to the vaccine. So the government was forced to ratify that convention, which I think we've discussed this. It's still good that it was ratified, but it reflects an attitude towards foreign investment. It reflects an attitude towards international agreements, conventions that are open to foreign direct investment that the government had. And I'm hoping that will change, because a change in attitude could result in further acts. On the WTO, I'm not entirely sure. I'm not the, but my understanding is that they have a working group, and they've held 2 meetings since 2004. So they're in the first stage of entering the WTO. There are a lot of changes, including the legal frameworks, need to take place before they reach that kind of level. And membership to the WTO, the benefits and the detriments can be debated, but I think an improvement in the legal framework most likely will result in.
I actually see that as a positive thing. I mean, I'm reminded of one of the most recent examples after the Quran burning in Sweden. The knee-jerk reaction from some circles in the Iraqi government was to shut down a contract that they have with Ericsson, a Swedish majority company. But then later, when the heads cooled off and you look at the contract and how much damage that causes, they kind of said, no, we're gonna honor the contract that they have with Ericsson. So that's outside-in approach is perhaps a good thing, and a positive thing.
Better than the alternative, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Let me go to Dr. Amer in Baghdad. So I mentioned earlier that Prime Minister Soudani in more than one speech and one pronouncement has signaled, to my memory, more than any other prime minister, that anti-corruption, fighting corruption is a priority for him. I should also note that since I've heard him be very loud about it at the beginning of his tenure, I'm not hearing it as often as I did in the beginning of his tenure as prime minister. So corruption remains a challenge, as you just heard from your 2 co-panelists. What do you think this government is realistically doing or achieving against corruption?
I think you're not hearing about it as often is because he's doing it. There is a time to talk about it, and there is time to do it. We already relieved some 60 DGs from their duties for performance and performance issues that may or may not have to do with corruption. Clearly, we cannot tell. One of the main challenges, we can't tell the difference between waste and theft or incompetence or corruption. These things they end up just costing us money. And so I think no one has relieved 60 DGs since 2003. I don't think even the former regime has not gone one fell swoop into 60 DGs. And by the way, the count is still on. It's not our first wave of reform, and we are now serious about evaluating even higher level of executive management. We're just doing it systematically and steady. You will be surprised, Safwan, and will be surprised when people come and say, let's do reform, especially with implementing partners. And I say, okay, let's go. What is it? What are you proposing? And then they just kind of, they don't give me the material that they want to reform, really. And I think that they're just surprised that someone wants to reform anything. It takes them a while to kind of gear up and start producing the work that needs to be done. I think a lot of it is like, hey, do you want to reform? And mostly people say, maybe. But now we are serious. I think that we're waiting a long time for specific proposals on reform, including the one Safwan mentioned.
Let me follow up on that particular point. I think firing or replacing DGs, I can see how that is politically appealing for an Iraqi audience, but I don't think a Western investor, like someone sitting in New York, is going to really take that as an improvement. So in terms of reforms, like in the corruption area, what is the Iraqi government doing to make Iraq less corrupt for the business, make the business environment less corrupt? Let me be more specific. Okay, oftentimes, I've heard too many officials basically say that, oh, corruption has become a culture, and I literally, to me that's very, distasteful, because that's a politician blaming the society. But the form of corruption that is deterring foreign business is the economic or financial or investment arms of the political parties who, pay millions of dollars to basically get this government job or that government job in order to translate that ministry or the contracts of that ministry into business opportunities. It's the political money that's in the business. So how can an American business or a European business, for that matter, go into Baghdad and actually speak only with a government official, with a minister, with a prime minister, with a DG, and not then go have a secondary conversation with, someone else who actually is the actual decision maker? That grand corruption, the patronage networks that we all, I think, understand. What is this government doing to address that form of corruption, which is the main deterrent, I think, to foreign investment?
Right. So let me tell you two things, and you give a lot of compound questions. So if I forget a part of it, please remind me.
I should ask simple questions. You're right. My
right.
bad.
So one of the things that you mentioned is that how does that help relieving DGs? DGs are the executive level. They have wide purview over deals, and in fact, in the past, it is known that it's at the DG level that you need to have the secondary conversation with. So putting competent and honest people in the DG level, that should signal, that should be a good signal for investors. That's number one. Number two, a lot of the corruption happens because there are spaces in the legislation that are left for internal regulations, right? And it is in the interpretation and enforcement or not enforcing the regulation that a lot of the corruption happens. And I'll give you a concrete example. So we are working on the public-private partnership law that has been kind of in limbo since 2017. And one of the main things that we are doing, and you're welcome to look at the draft, is that we are making it very clear what the agreement should look like. We are putting in the law, we are saying if the law changes, then the law that was applicable at the time of signing the agreement is the one that's applicable, which is something that Safwan pointed at. We are making sure that transparent procurement is taking place so that there isn't really enough time and there isn't enough wiggle room for the secondary conversation to be of any use. Apart from that, you're welcome. I mean, there are these doing things right takes a lot of variables into account. And I will say that the policy paper alone that is on PPP is about 100 pages, wherein we discuss in detail how the procurement is transparent, how there is a recourse if you feel that it's not transparent, if the agreement is breached, that you can go into arbitration under the New York Convention that Safwan said we were forced to ratify. And so a lot of the things were taken into place. We're taking concrete steps into making this into binding and into law and in practice.
Very interesting. Let me get to some of the questions that I've already received. Some questions, some comments. I have a question that we somehow addressed from Jawad Yusuf. Even if we put security matters aside, we still need to deal with corruption, and education's output has bad reputation. Besides lack of expertise, so how does the Iraqi government provide foreign investor with a good environment for investment? I think we've covered much of this. There's a word education there, which I think is important because in my intro, I had talked about entrepreneurship. And I have, from an anonymous attendee, a comment, other countries are doing far better, ties in directly to both corruption and, quote, a hands-off approach by the US government in assisting and promoting US businesses. The other comment is, this has little to do with perception. Ease of Doing Business Index puts Iraq at 172 out of 190 World Bank, and I think that's the 2020, or was it 2020?
2020, yeah, the World Bank, yeah.
Was the last one. Let me see, we have
the perception was on corruption, not the ease of doing business.
Yes, we have. I don't think we had the numbers, so thank you for sharing that. But here comes the question. As a sign of confidence, should the US government invest the government employees' savings, the US thrift savings plan, to investments in Iraq? The pension plan. Is Iraq safe enough for American pensions?
Is that towards me? I take it since I'm the government employee.
May I answer that since I'm the one who has hedge fund experience?
Take a first crack at it. I think Mais will be relieved.
Yeah, well, I think that's not really a question for any country. The pension plans have very stringent risk management rules and grades of bonds that have to, certain grades of bonds that are very limiting. Pension plans are not exactly, that's like saying, has Iraq gone to grade A bonds? And that's not, I think that's not a serious question.
But I can tell you other US investments that are happening in Iraq already. So now, as the Development Finance Corporation has currently an investment project in the north of Iraq and is exploring other projects in Iraq. And so that itself, and they did sign a memorandum of understanding with the new government of up to investing up to, I think, $1 billion worth of investment. So that itself should be a signal in the fact that US government policy is shifting to trying to change the tides in the relationship into being more commercial and providing a springboard for more private sector ties.
So let's talk, actually segue into what has worked. because yes, we looked at, certain, like a laundry list of challenges, but there are American businesses in Iraq, right? So the energy sector, I think, is the most obvious one. But last time I was there, I also saw KFC and Cinnabon. So what is working and why?
I think trade is working. Anywhere when you're in a situation where you have perception of corruption, perception of lack of doing business, then the next best step is to improve trade, because with good trade leads to then better joint ventures and then larger infrastructure investments. And the more that you improve trade, the more then you can develop those relationships. And you see a lot of products, U.S. products, going into the market via their, kind of regional agent. And also you have a rise in franchising, and you have a rise in tourism and hospitality, and you have a rise in the housing sector as well. And that signals that with increased trade, there is increased trust and increased, let's say, cooperation between U.S. companies and the private sector, which will lead to potentially better engagement and more trust to move forward to manufacturing, distribution, infrastructure, and therefore. But it's that's a good sign when you see once the Whopper has landed, which it has. I think it's a good sign that others will come around.
There was a theory that was later debunked in international relations.
McDonald's.
That democracies don't go to war against each other. And then someone came up with a version that says countries with McDonald's don't go to war against each other. But then, facts on the ground debunk that. Safwan, let me ask you a question about something that actually Mais referred to earlier. We talked about how American business in particular is kind of squeamish about the Iraqi business landscape, and I think the comparison to Egypt is quite illustrative. But Gulf businesses in particular, and you worked in the Gulf for a while, so you have that purview. They seem to be finding their footing in the Iraqi market, be it in services like like telecom, for example, or the real estate market, which is booming in Iraq. What is it that the Gulf countries having go for them that is not the case for American business?
So I mean, there are many reasons for that. Like off the top of my head, I would say familiarity, doing business, like business culture, language barriers don't exist. There are historic relationships between traders, businessmen in Iraq and the Gulf. There is also government support, and in some cases that's direct government support, where governments directly, make sure that the interests of the private companies that are investing in Iraq or operating in Iraq are protected to the extent that they can. There are a host of reasons. I mean, within the legal framework, I would say, there are some treaties between the Organization of Islamic Countries and also Arab League treaties that protect investments. That's one point that needs to be discussed about bilateral trade between the US and Iraq. There's no treaty, as far as I'm aware. There was a trade and investment framework agreement that established a council to look at trade and investment between the two countries.
That has implications for exit, is it?
For
exit? Exit?
So if you jurisdiction for exit, arbitration under the International Center is mainly by consent, and one form of consent is through a treaty. So you can't, an investor of a member country cannot take Iraq or any other government to arbitration without there being an underlying treaty between the two countries or express consent. So that has implications. But I mean, that's not the only thing that kind of helps Gulf countries, Gulf companies invest in Iraq. There are a host of reasons. And also it's easier to mobilize resources, in some cases equipment also from the Gulf to Iraq rather than from other places. And also, I think the choices for Gulf regional conglomerates are more limited than a huge US multinational. So a huge US multinational, the world is its oyster. It can choose in different regions, and there are, you mentioned Asia as kind of the favored destination at the moment. Whereas in the Gulf, it's easier for them to mobilize resources and kind of stay regionally where they feel like more comfortable with the environment. There could be other reasons, but those are kind of the reasons that I can think of.
Fair enough. I think that is at least one example where business, like cash flow, follows diplomatic flow. I think there's been some reopening of Iraq toward its Gulf neighbors, and it's quite, I think, interesting and encouraging to see that money actually follows those diplomatic openings. Dr. Amer, let me ask you two questions back to back, but I'm going to make them simple. Do Baghdad and Erbil coordinate their efforts in attracting foreign direct investment, or is it a competition?
Say that again.
Sure. Do Baghdad and Erbil, the KRG, cooperate and coordinate their efforts to make Iraq more attractive to foreign investment, or is it a competition between the KRG and the federal government? Do they work together or against each other? But different.
To a certain. Okay, so I'll give you an example. I wrote the PPP law for both jurisdictions. So in that specific instant, that would be an example of coordination. Any two jurisdictions, even between provinces, obviously there is competition, but that does not mean there is no coordination at the same time. So I feel like competition between jurisdictions make better terms for investors. I would like to also say that now, if you want to invest in the industrial sector in Iraq, you have up to 10 years of advantages like tax reliefs and things. We are removing restrictions on exports, and also you can own the land. So you get free land now if you invest, and these are some serious steps.
I think land ownership is definitely a serious step. Let me ask you a question that came from obviously a paper hater. What is Iraq doing to digitize and use electronic bits rather than rely on paper?
That is a very good question. In fact, now you cannot even file a complaint in the against Nazaha, when you try
Integrity Commission.
Yeah, the Integrity Commission. You can't even do it with paper. You got to email it. So we're reducing. It's not exactly automation and e-governance, but it's definitely reducing some of the stuff. We're making some head. So let me tell you who's doing it, and maybe that will give you a better signal of how serious we are. His Excellency brought on someone with about 74 patents in communication technology. He was at the C-level at Microsoft, an Iraqi American, and he is leading the digital transformation of Iraq. And this is needed before we go seriously into e-governance and e-government.
Very good. Let me get some of the questions and comments that we've gotten from our audience. I have it from Tai Badri, who says that Iraqi economic system is a communist system, so it will never merge with Western economic system. I have a question. Actually, I have a comment from the anonymous attendee who asked a question about U.S. pensions being indirectly invested or directly invested in Iraq. It's a comeback. That was a serious question, and as one who has decades more experience with funds and a CFA and a CFA, that is a parameter often used. If government employees won't invest their money into a program, then steer clear of the policy recommendations. I should also point out in support of this particular comment here. Last year, I had actually earlier this year, I'm sorry, in March, I hosted a panel like this one, and I hosted General Petraeus, who now works at KKR. We're talking mostly about his role in the military and in the intelligence. But then I ended up by asking him a question about how he sees Iraq now from his vantage point in Wall Street. And of course, KKR invests in much of the pension funds. And that was his answer, that in the absence of rule of law, he would find it very hard to risk American pension monies in a market like Iraq's. So tying these points together, feel free, anyone who wants to jump at this, but I'm just going to read this other comment by Tai Badri. It says, are you saying that Iraq is too close, too friendly to Cuba? Okay, I read your question. I think that should be it. I have a question from Francis Magda now, but let me get to your comments on what we just heard from the audience.
I mean, I don't think I have a comment on the TSP because I would want to research that further to see where, if that even is the case for the US and other countries. So I would have to kind of not be able to comment on that one. The comment regarding is Iraq as close to Cuba? I'm still trying to understand where that is, but I think all the comments that I've made is trying to say, again, to the first two words that I use, is being cautiously optimistic. And I think Iraq, for those who have worked in the Beltway that are here present or virtually, have seen the changes. And they're little and they go unnoticed, and but they definitely need to be noticed. For instance, the mere nomination of someone from the diaspora working in the Iraqi government is itself should be a symbol of someone bringing in from Microsoft experience, or someone who had, obviously Dr. Amer, who's had Wall Street experience, coming into working is it's a different feel. It's a different Iraq, and it keeps changing and it's moving forward. Yes, they've had some setbacks, but I think for all of those who are in DC who have watched it for decades, can tell you the days where we would walk in and just using the word economic reform at TIFA discussions, trade and investment framework agreements, would stay at the discussion of visas.
Yes, I think the visa point is great.
I'm just saying we would talk with US companies about visas for a decade.
Right.
And then now we're talking about taxes. And now we're talking about investments.
Right.
And that
Customs.
evolution needs to be recognized by US companies.
That's fair.
And I think that's really, really important.
I think that's a good point. This question might also be appropriate for you, Mais. It's from Abbas Abousy. What business sector in Iraq you want to see more US involvement in?
I think more trade. I like to start small and build up. I am a strong believer that increased trade and, taking and eliminating barriers to trade is what's going to develop the trust and confidence with the private sector in order to build up. Because trade, and I know everyone kind of poo-poos franchising, but what I like to say is that it really does take out all the dirt under the rug. You have to deal with customs standards, legal battles, conflict resolution, from simple things as far as food items, materials, and the people who are doing business. And more importantly, there is a balance between the risk and obligations from the buyer, the seller, to the franchisor or franchisee, whether we're not talking about just food, we're talking about just trade is the first way to go. And I think the US government should force and support work and effort to improve, removing barriers to trade. Consularization being the first one of them. Egypt finally removed consularization. I think it's one of the first Arab states to the Arab to do so after, decades of US government support for that. If Iraq removes that, and I think it did, there's some policy, my understanding, where you just pay a fine of $500 instead, that would help a lot.
Let me ask you, maybe to Safwan, this is a question from Frank McDonough. Does the US need to do business with Iraq to keep pace with Chinese investment in the country? Are the Chinese major players?
I mean, that's a geopolitical question rather than a legal one, but the Chinese, there are Chinese companies operating in Iraq, obviously, and especially in the energy sector. And so, I mean, that's a policy consideration for the U.S. government, whether it thinks that, you know, the Iraqi market is worth competing for with China. It's as I said, and it's a good thing that U.S. companies take compliance very, very seriously, but that creates a cost for U.S. companies, and other companies and from other companies sometimes do not. And so that cost it's an asymmetric kind of situation. And the U.S. government, you know, should not allow, you know, U.S. companies to ignore Iraqi laws and not comply with Iraqi laws. So, but it's a geopolitical question. I wanted to go back a little bit on to say that the Iraqi economy is a communist economy, or, you know, it's close to Cuba. I mean, that it seems slightly unfair, but it's gone through an evolution. And the starting point was close to that, I think. And it's been evolving. Now, there have been ups and downs, but I think exactly, there have been some regression, but I think the overall trajectory, I don't know, I mean, I think you agree with me, Mace, it's not as steep and it's not as positive as we want, but it's been positive. But there are niggling things like, you know, clients and companies will complain about having to legalize documents in a very kind of archaic way, and getting, you know, to legalize a document, sometimes you have to go to the central bank. I
work at the central bank.
Yeah, to legalize to legalize your documents, like you need a stamp from different, in some cases, the central bank.
But that's kind of extreme to go to the central bank to
different functions. Yeah, I mean, the paperwork is difficult. Now, it's not the only thing that's stopping people from investing, but it's one of those things. There are issues with the labor law. I mean, as progressive as it is, and I'm all for that, but there are serious restrictions on termination of employees. It's not easy to terminate an employee in Iraq under Iraqi law. There are a list of causes which are quite extreme. And then even in the cases of redundancy, you need the approval of the Minister of Labor to make people redundant, and that the project is no longer viable, and that, I mean, you've transferred a redundancy situation to the political sphere. No minister, or maybe not no minister, but it's very difficult for a minister to take, who's a political appointee and probably has election ambitions, etc., and has a constituency, is going to approve a request for redundancy that may lay off tens or hundreds of people.
It's the opposite, actually. The incentive is to hire more people.
Exactly. So it's very, I mean, these are little things here and there that, I mean, from what it sounds like, these have been identified by the government and they're looking at reforming. But those are little things that can be off-putting for an investor, and especially a U.S. investor who is strict about complying with the local laws.
Dr. Amer, we're at the end of our time. Let me ask you two consecutive questions. One, just picking up from where Safwan ended, labor laws. Is that part of your reform portfolio? Is that something you're looking at? Since I also mentioned earlier that the private sector is the way to go, but the private sector, one of the reasons why it cannot compete is because the labor laws favor public employees more than private sector employees. So is that on your desk?
That's not how I heard Safwan say it. Safwan said it's very difficult to fire people. And I agree, it's too difficult to fire people. That is also a relic of the socialist era. And as an American economist, you can be sure I'm against it. And so we're going to be putting policies to increase the freedom of entrepreneurs to hire the best candidates possible. There was a comment in the comment section talking about how difficult it is to find talented people. And so while I was hiring for my reform cell, I interviewed about 200 people. And I found two people. They were top of their class, computer science. And of course, I wouldn't know a good computer scientist if I met one. But Dr. Hassan, who was a computer scientist and a professor from a US university, and again from Microsoft, he met them and he said they are absolutely first rate. And so that's 1%. That's not so bad, right? I mean, 1% is pretty good. Top rate though. And so this is a comment. I think that you'll be happy to know that we're taking a very systematic approach to mobilize factors of production, land, labor, and capital. We're looking at modernizing the banking system. We're doing this very systematically. I got a little picture, looks like a house, and you can see that we have prioritized and thought of all the components that would make up a good business environment. The only thing I haven't put in the house is the administrative reform, which is what Safwan again so astutely pointed out. Yes, administrative reform is key and a major challenge. And yeah, I think this is one of the things that is going to be most challenging.
The other interesting breaking news this week was that the Prime Minister and the Cabinet has approved the creation of a sovereign wealth fund.
The Iraq Development Fund, yeah.
It's called the Iraq Development Fund, yes.
It's not an it's not a SWF per se. It's an internal development fund. It's I guess some sovereign wealth funds are geared towards internal investment. Yeah, it's that has happened. Mace could tell you more. Mace is more, she's the best informed person about.
Look from Baghdad. Mace, what do you know about this development?
I mean, it's. I think my understanding is just got approved, and the funds have just been recently allocated, and the person who's in charge of it was here in Washington D.C. A few months ago, and I think that is still in development as far as the organizational process, the priority of projects, the requirements, and all the lending products that it plans to provide. So it is still in a very, I would imagine it's still in its infancy, so.
See, I knew all that, but she just says it so much better than I can.
But FDI was one of its main objectives. I mean, according to the law that was, or the regulation that was passed.
I just think that, establishing it is a step in the right direction.
Yes.
I think managing it well and making sure that it's not a cookie jar for the government is the next step. But I agree. This is infancy, and it's just, as May said earlier. Now that we're not worrying about security or visas, we're moving on into the conversation is going into more serious issues. And yes, we're talking about labor laws, and we're talking about sovereign wealth funds or development funds.
About the cookie jar comment, the World Bank worked very diligently with the Iraqi government to make sure that the bylaws are written in the right way, so that all the right governance around it would be according to international standards.
Right. Well, as of now, I think the Prime Minister is running it, and I think the next step would be to actually give it to someone who is an investor and who looks at it from a purely investment and financial perspective and purview, rather than political convenience. I think we covered quite a large and wide swath of territory about the Iraq business landscape and how U.S. businesses see it. I'm very grateful to all of you who joined us. Mais Abousy, Safwan Al-Amin, and Amer Aladhadh. Thank you all for joining us, for sharing your expertise and insights. And thank you for joining our policy forum today. Thank you for your comments and questions, and for making the conversation more engaging. Stay tuned. We have more policy forums like this. Thanks again for tuning in, and have a good afternoon.